I was standing at the altar in my dream dress when my maid of honor grabbed the microphone and said, "Before this ceremony continues, everyone needs to know that the bride is my sister." The chapel went silent. I stared at her in shock because we'd been best friends for 15 years, and I knew for certain she wasn't my sister when we got the DNA results back. I discovered a family secret so dark it destroyed everything I thought I knew about my life. It was supposed to be the perfect day, September 22, 2024, at the Willowbrook Gardens Chapel in Asheville, North Carolina. I'd been planning this wedding for 22 months. Ever since Marcus proposed to me on New Year's Eve with my grandmother's vintage emerald ring that had been reset in white gold. Every single detail was exactly how I'd imagined it since I was 8 years old, playing dress-up in my mother's closet and pretending to walk down an imaginary aisle. My name is Camila Rose Henderson, and at 30 years old, I was finally having my fairy tale moment. The dress was everything I'd dreamed of, a custom creation by a local designer named Elena Vasquez. Made of Italian silk with hand-sewn seed pearls cascading down the bodice in delicate vine patterns, the skirt flowed like liquid moonlight with a cathedral train that took 2 people to range properly. I'd lost 15 pounds to fit into it perfectly. Spending 6 months doing yoga at sunrise and meal prepping quinoa bowls that tasted like cardboard but made me feel virtuous. The chapel itself was something out of a Pinterest board I'd been curating since college, built in 1892. It had soaring arched windows that let in streams of golden afternoon light. Original hardwood floors that creaked romantically when you walked down the aisle, and ivy climbing up the stone exterior walls. The inside smelled like old wood polish, and the hundreds of white garden roses we'd arranged in cascading displays along every pew. Marcus Alexander Chen was standing at the altar looking like he'd stepped out of a magazine, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a charcoal gray tuxedo that his mother had insisted on having custom tailored in Chicago. His black hair was perfectly styled, though I could see one stubborn piece sticking up in the back that he probably didn't realize was there. He had this nervous habit of adjusting his cufflinks when he was anxious. And I watched him do it 3 times as I stood in the vestibule, waiting for my cue to walk down the aisle. We'd met 4 years ago at a coffee shop in downtown Asheville called Mountain Morning Brew. I was a marketing coordinator for a sustainable clothing company called EcoThread, working on my laptop at a corner table when he accidentally grabbed my lavender oat milk latte instead of his plain black coffee. He was a software engineer for a tech startup that developed apps for small businesses, and he had this way of explaining complicated things that made them sound simple and fascinating. We talked for 3 hours that first day, until the barista started stacking chairs on tables around us. Our relationship had been steady, comfortable, built on shared values and compatible life goals. We both wanted kids 2, maybe 3. We both preferred hiking to nightclubs, cooking at home to expensive restaurants, and spending Sunday mornings reading different sections of the newspaper while sharing a pot of Ethiopian coffee. He proposed exactly when I expected him to, after we'd talked about marriage seriously for 8 months and looked at rings together twice. It wasn't a surprise, but it was perfect. Planned, thoughtful. Everything I'd told myself I wanted in a partner. My parents, Robert and Linda Henderson, were sitting in the front row on the left side. My father looked distinguished in his navy suit, his silver hair freshly cut for the occasion. He'd walked me through a practice run the night before, showing me how to link my arm through his without wrinkling the dress fabric. My mother was already crying happy tears. She assured me, dabbing at her eyes with the vintage lace handkerchief that had belonged to my great-grandmother Rosalie. She was wearing a dusty blue dress that complemented her gray hair, which she'd had styled in soft waves at the salon that morning. They'd driven down from their home in Charlotte, where my father worked as an accountant for a mid-sized firm and my mother taught 3rd grade at an elementary school called Magnolia Creek. They'd been married for 35 years, high school sweethearts who'd done everything the right way, dated for 3 years, engaged for 1, married at 22, bought a house with a white picket fence, had their only child me 2 years later. They were the kind of couple that other couples looked up to, stable and predictable and never the center of any drama. Marcus's family had flown in from California. His parents, Dr. James Chen and Dr. Patricia Liu Chen, both cardiac surgeons who spoke in medical terminology even at dinner parties. And his younger brother Kevin, who was finishing his residency in pediatrics. They were intimidatingly accomplished, the kind of family that made me feel like I needed to have more advanced degrees and a clearer 5-year plan. But they'd been nothing but warm and welcoming, especially Patricia, who'd insisted I call her mom from the moment Marcus and I got engaged. The guest list was exactly 127 people. I'd counted 3 times to make sure we didn't go over the chapel's capacity. There were college friends from UNC Chapel Hill, where I'd studied communications and spent 4 years learning how to write press releases and manage social media accounts. Co-workers from EcoThread, including my boss Samantha, who'd given me the day off and a bonus to help pay for the photographer. Neighbors from our duplex on Haywood Street, where Marcus and I had been living together for 2 years, trying to save money for a down payment on a house with a proper yard. And scattered throughout the pews were the people who'd shaped my life in small but significant ways. Mrs. Patterson, my high school English teacher who'd encouraged me to apply for the scholarship that made college possible. My college roommate, Zoe, who'd driven down from Virginia with her husband and twin toddlers. My yoga instructor Melody, who'd somehow managed to make flexibility feel like a spiritual practice rather than torture. But the most important person, besides Marcus obviously, was standing right next to me in a flowing dress the color of soft sage green, my maid of honor and best friend since we were 15 years old. Valentina Vale Rosarios. Vale was the sister I'd never had, the person who knew me better than anyone else in the world, including my parents and sometimes even Marcus. We'd met during sophomore year of high school when she transferred to Asheville Preparatory Academy from somewhere in Florida. I remember her walking into AP history class in the middle of October, wearing a vintage band t-shirt and ripped jeans that somehow looked elegant instead of sloppy. Her long dark hair into braids that she'd woven with tiny silver bells that chimed softly when she moved. She was everything I wasn't, confident where I was anxious, spontaneous where I was cautious, effortlessly cool where I had to work at being interesting. She had this way of walking into a room and immediately becoming the center of attention without seeming like she was trying. People gravitated toward her like she had some kind of magnetic field that made ordinary conversations feel more important. But for some reason, she chose me as her best friend. Maybe it was because I was the only person in our class who didn't immediately start asking her personal questions about why she'd transferred schools. Maybe it was because I offered to share my color-coded history notes without being asked. Or maybe it was because when Brittany Morrison made a snide comment about Vale's weird hippie jewelry, I told Brittany to mind her own business loud enough for half the cafeteria to hear. Whatever the reason, we became inseparable. Vale would sleep over at my house almost every weekend, and we'd stay up until 3 in the morning talking about everything: boys, college plans, whether we believed in soulmates, what we thought our lives would look like when we were 30. She had this way of asking questions that made me think about things I'd never considered before. While other teenagers were worried about prom dates and set scores, Vale would wonder things like whether parallel universes existed or if animals had more complex emotional lives than humans gave them credit for. She was also the first person I came out to when I had my brief experimental phase with Rachel Hendricks during senior year. Vale didn't make it into a big deal or ask awkward questions. She just nodded and said, "Cool. Want to get ice cream and talk about how Rachel's definitely too good for any of us." When I decided I was mostly attracted to men after all, she didn't treat it like I'd been confused or going through a phase. She just accepted that sexuality could be fluid and that people were allowed to figure themselves out at their own pace. After high school, we went to different colleges. I stayed in North Carolina at UNC, while Vale went to Savannah College of Art and Design to study photography. But we never lost touch. We'd text each other multiple times a day, call each other every Sunday night, and spend our spring breaks and summer vacations together. Sometimes at my parents' house in Charlotte, sometimes on road trips to places like Charleston or Nashville or wherever Vale's artistic impulses led us. She had this gift for finding beauty in unexpected places, while I was learning about market research and brand positioning. Vale was taking photographs of abandoned gas stations and old women feeding pigeons in city parks. And chain-link fences covered in morning glory vines. Her Instagram account was like a curated gallery of moments that most people would walk past without noticing: raindrops on spider webs, shadows cast by fire escapes. The way afternoon light hit a pile of autumn leaves. After college, she moved to Portland, Oregon, where she worked as a freelance photographer for weddings, local magazines, and small businesses that needed product shots. She lived in a converted warehouse space with 2 roommates who were also artists, a painter named River and a sculptor who went by just Blue. She'd send me pictures of her latest work, and I'd send her updates about my latest marketing campaigns and whatever Marcus and I had cooked for dinner that week. When Marcus proposed, Vale was the first person I called, even before I called my parents. She screamed so loud over FaceTime that her roommates came running to make sure she wasn't being murdered. Within 2 hours, she'd booked a flight to Asheville to see the ring in person and start talking about wedding plans. "I call maid of honor," she'd announced, settling onto my couch with a glass of wine and a notebook she'd apparently brought specifically for wedding planning purposes. "And before you say anything, yes, I know I live across the country, but I will make this work. This is going to be the most beautiful wedding anyone has ever seen," and she'd kept that promise. For the past 22 months, Vale had been more involved in planning my wedding than Marcus was, which he found both amusing and slightly intimidating. She'd flown to Asheville 6 times to help with venue tours, dress shopping, cake tastings, and floral arrangements. She'd created a shared Pinterest board with over 400 pins organized into categories like ceremony decor, reception lighting, and backup plans for rain. She'd researched photographers, interviewed musicians, and even helped me write my vows by asking me questions about what I loved most about Marcus and what I hoped our marriage would look like in twin tires. The sage green dress she was wearing had been her idea. "It's the color of new growth," she'd explained when we found it at a boutique in Charlotte. "Like how your relationship is growing into marriage, and how our friendship keeps growing even though we're in different life phases." She had this way of finding symbolic meaning in everything, which could sometimes be exhausting but was exactly what I needed from a best friend. She'd flown in 3 days early to help with last-minute details, staying in my childhood bedroom at my parents' house and immediately charming my mother by helping her rearrange the flowers and a fairy, and to assist with any tasks that needed an extra pair of hands. My father, who was usually reserved around my friends, had warmed up to her quickly when she started asking him about his vintage car collection and actually listened to his 20-minute explanation of why a 1967 Mustang was superior to any modern vehicle. "She's good for you," my mother had said while we were doing my hair that morning. "She brings out your adventurous side." And that was true. Vale had always pushed me to try things I wouldn't have considered on my own, like the time she convinced me to go skydiving for my 25th birthday, or when she taught me how to develop photos in a real darkroom, or all the impromptu road trips where we'd pick a direction and drive until we found something interesting. She made me feel braver, more spontaneous, more willing to take risks. The morning of the wedding, she'd been the perfect maid of honor. She'd helped me into my dress, arranging the train and adjusting the sleeves until everything looked exactly right. She'd fixed my makeup when I started crying during the hairstylist's final touches, and she'd given me a pep talk when I had a moment of panic about whether I was making the right decision. "Camila," she'd said, holding my hands and looking directly into my eyes, "you and Marcus are perfect together. You balance each other out. He grounds you, and you inspire him to be more open to new experiences. This is exactly what's supposed to happen." She'd been calm and organized and everything I needed her to be when the photographer wanted to take pre-ceremony shots. Vale had made sure my dress was arranged perfectly for every photo. When my cousin's toddler had a meltdown in the vestibule, Vale had quietly distracted him with a bag of crackers she'd brought specifically for that purpose. When I realized I'd forgotten to eat lunch, she'd produced a protein bar and made me eat half of it while lecturing me about maintaining my blood sugar levels. Now, as I stood in the back of the chapel holding my bouquet of white peonies and eucalyptus, watching the string quartet play the opening notes of Canon in D, Vale was beside me making final adjustments to my train and whispering last-minute encouragements. "You look absolutely radiant," she said, her voice soft but confident. "This is your moment, Cam. Everything you've dreamed of." The chapel was full but not crowded, with guests seated in wooden pews that had been decorated with simple white ribbon bows and small arrangements of baby's breath. Afternoon sunlight was streaming through the stained glass windows, casting colored patterns across the altar where Marcus was waiting with his best man, his brother Kevin, and our officiant, Pastor Williams, who'd known my family for 15 years. The photographer, a woman named Isabel whom Vale had found and highly recommended, was positioned discreetly to the side, capturing everything without being intrusive. The videographer was even less noticeable, blending into the background, while documenting what was supposed to be the most important day of my life. Everything was exactly as I'd imagined it. The flowers were perfect, the music was beautiful. The lighting was soft and romantic. My dress fit like it had been made for my body, which it had. Marcus looked handsome and nervous and completely devoted. My parents looked proud and emotional in all the right ways. And Vale, my best friend, my chosen sister, my maid of honor, was standing beside me in her sage green dress, holding my bouquet and preparing to walk down the aisle ahead of me. Just like we'd rehearsed the night before, it was supposed to be the beginning of my happily ever after. I had no idea it was about to become the day that destroyed everything I thought I knew about my family, my best friend, and my entire life. The processional began exactly at 4:30 p.m., just as we'd planned during our 3 rehearsals. Pastor Williams took his position at the altar, his familiar face calm and reassuring as he opened his warm leather Bible. The string quartet for musicians from the Asheville Symphony that Vale had somehow convinced to play my wedding for half their usual rate began. The gentle opening notes of Pachelbel's Canon in D. Kevin Chen, Marcus's younger brother and best man, walked down the aisle first. He moved with the same confident stride as Marcus, though he kept glancing around the chapel like he was still surprised to find himself in North Carolina instead of his usual hospital in San Diego. His black tuxedo was identical to Marcus's, and he carried himself with that particular brand of Chen family composure that made everyone in their orbit feel slightly underdressed. Behind him came the groomsman, Marcus's college roommate Tyler, who'd driven down from Virginia with his wife, his coworker Jake from the tech startup, who'd closed a major deal just to attend the wedding, and my cousin Danny, who'd reluctantly agreed to be in the wedding party after my mother's persistent requests and promises that he'd look handsome in the photographs. Then it was time for the bridesmaids. My college friend Zoe walked down first, radiant in her sage green dress despite having given birth to twins just 8 months earlier. She moved carefully but confidently, having practiced this walk in heels she swore she'd never wear again after today. Her husband was somewhere in the 3rd row, probably managing their toddlers with a combination of snacks and silent prayers. Next came my coworker Samantha, looking elegant and professional even in formal wear, followed by Marcus's sister-in-law Jennifer, who'd flown in from California specifically for this role despite having met me only twice before. Each bridesmaid carried a smaller version of my bouquet, white roses and eucalyptus tied with sage green ribbon, simple but sophisticated. The chapel felt warm and full, filled with the quiet murmur of guests settling into their seats and the soft rustle of programs being opened. I could see elderly Mrs. Patterson dabbing at her eyes already, and my father's business partner giving him an approving nod from across the aisle. The photographer moved silently between the pews, capturing candid moments of anticipation and joy. Then came the moment I'd been dreaming about since I was 8 years old. Vales walked down the aisle as my maid of honor. She stepped into the doorway, and I felt my heart swell with affection and gratitude. She looked absolutely stunning in her sage green dress, her long dark hair swept into an elegant updo that showed off the vintage pearl earrings I'd given her as a bridesmaid gift. She carried my bouquet with both hands, moving with that natural Grace that had always made me slightly envious and completely proud to call her my best friend. But something was different about her walk. Usually, Vale moved through the world with this effortless confidence, like she belonged wherever she happened to be. Today, she seemed focused, determined, like she was walking toward something specific rather than simply participating in a ceremony. I noticed she wasn't smiling the way we'd practiced. During our rehearsals, she'd been all gentle grins and excited energy, practically bouncing on her toes as we went through the motions. Now her face was serious, almost grave, and she kept her eyes fixed straight ahead instead of acknowledging the guests who were smiling at her from the pews. "She looks nervous," my mother whispered beside me, adjusting her own grip on the handkerchief. That was already damp with happy tears. First time being a maid of honor, probably just wants everything to be perfect. But I knew Vale better than anyone, and this wasn't nervousness. This was something else entirely. Something that made my stomach do a small, inexplicable flip even though I couldn't identify what was wrong. She reached the altar and took her position to the left of where I would soon be standing. Pastor Williams smiled at her warmly. They'd met during the rehearsal dinner and had bonded over a shared interest in philosophy and social justice. Marcus caught her eye and gave her a small nod of acknowledgement, the same gesture he'd given each of the other bridesmaids. But instead of setting my bouquet down on the small table we'd positioned specifically for that purpose, Vale held onto it, and instead of turning to face the back of the chapel to watch my entrance like we'd rehearsed, she remained facing forward, her gaze fixed on the congregation. That's when I noticed the microphone. Pastor Williams had a small wireless microphone clipped to his collar for the ceremony, but there was also a handheld microphone on a stand near the altar, positioned there in case anyone wanted to do a reading or share a special message during the service. We decided against including any additional speakers in our ceremony, just the traditional vows, the ring exchange, and Pastor Williams's blessing, but the sound equipment was there anyway, part of the chapel's standard setup. Vale was standing less than 2 feet away from that microphone stand. The music reached its crescendo, signaling that it was time for my entrance. My father appeared beside me, looking distinguished and emotional as he offered his arm. He'd been practicing this moment in our living room for weeks, making sure he knew exactly how to escort me down the aisle without stepping on my train or moving too quickly for the photographer. "Ready, sweetheart?" he asked, his voice slightly thick with emotion. "You look absolutely beautiful. Your mother and I are so proud of you." I nodded, trying to shake off the strange feeling that had settled in my chest while watching Vale's unusual behavior. This was my wedding day. This was supposed to be perfect. Whatever was bothering my best friend, we could talk about it later, maybe during the reception or tomorrow morning when all the stress had passed. The chapel doors opened fully, and every guest turned to look at me. I could see faces I'd known for years, family members, college friends, coworkers, neighbors, all of them smiling with the particular joy that people reserve for weddings and baby showers and other celebrations of life's major milestones. Marcus was at the altar, and the sight of him made my heart rate slow down slightly. He looked handsome and nervous and completely devoted. Exactly the way a groom should look when he sees his bride for the first time on their wedding day. His eyes met mine across the length of the chapel, and he gave me that small, private smile that had made me fall in love with him 4 years ago in a coffee shop. My father and I began our walk down the aisle, moving slowly and carefully to the rhythm of the music. My dress flowed behind me like liquid silk, and I could feel the weight of the cathedral train that 2 people had carefully arranged before the ceremony began. The photographer was capturing every step, every smile, every moment of what was supposed to be the most important walk of my life. Halfway down the aisle, I glanced toward Vale again, hoping to share a moment of eye contact that would reassure me that everything was fine. But she wasn't looking at me. She was still facing the congregation, still holding my bouquet, still standing in that unnaturally rigid posture that didn't match her usual flowing movement. And she was reaching for the microphone. At first, I thought maybe Pastor Williams had asked her to adjust the equipment or move it out of the way. But as I continued walking toward the altar, I watched Vale's hand close around the microphone and lift it from its stand. She brought it close to her mouth, and I could see her taking a deep breath, preparing to speak. This wasn't part of the ceremony. We'd gone through every moment of the service multiple times, and at no point was Vale supposed to say anything other than "I do" when Pastor Williams asked if anyone had objections to the marriage. The handheld microphone was supposed to remain untouched throughout the entire ceremony. My father must have sensed my confusion because he slowed our pace slightly and leaned toward me. "Everything okay, sweetheart?" But I couldn't answer because I was too focused on Vale, who was now standing with the microphone in her hand, looking out at the 127 guests who had come to celebrate my marriage to Marcus. The string quartet was still playing, but I could sense their confusion as they watched my maid of honor prepare to speak at a moment when nothing was scheduled to happen. Marcus was looking confused too. He glanced from Vale to me and back again, his eyebrows slightly raised in that expression he got when he was trying to solve a problem he didn't fully understand. Kevin, standing beside him as best man, shifted uncomfortably and looked toward Pastor Williams for guidance. Pastor Williams himself seemed uncertain about what was happening. He'd officiated dozens of weddings over his 15-year career, and he knew when something was deviating from the planned script. His kind face showed a mixture of confusion and concern as he watched Vale prepare to address the congregation. The chapel had gone quiet except for the string quartet, who were still playing but with less confidence, like they weren't sure if they should continue or stop. Guests were turning in their seats, following everyone's gaze toward Vale, sensing that something unplanned was about to happen but not knowing whether it was a surprise addition to the ceremony or something else entirely. My mother, still standing in the vestibule where she'd been watching my entrance, had gone pale. She was gripping her handkerchief so tightly that her knuckles were white, and she was looking back and forth between Vale and me like she was trying to solve a puzzle with missing pieces. I was still walking toward the altar because I didn't know what else to do. My father was still escorting me, though I could feel his confusion and the way his pace had become slightly uneven. We were less than 20 feet from Marcus now, close enough that I could see the concern in his dark eyes and the way he was unconsciously adjusting his cufflinks in that nervous gesture I'd grown to love. That's when Vale raised the microphone to her lips and spoke. "Excuse me," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the chapel's sound system. "I'm sorry to interrupt, but before this ceremony continues, there's something everyone needs to know." The string quartet stopped playing immediately, leaving the chapel in complete silence except for the sound of my heart beating so loudly I was sure everyone could hear it. Every single person in the building was now looking at Vale, who was standing at the altar in her sage green dress, holding my bouquet in one hand and the microphone in the other. My father and I had stopped walking completely. I could feel him tense beside me, his protective instincts kicking in even though neither of us understood what we needed to be protected from. Behind me, I could hear my mother's sharp intake of breath and the rustle of guests shifting in their seats. Marcus took a step forward, his hand slightly extended like he was thinking about reaching for the microphone. "Vale, what are you?" But she continued speaking before he could finish his sentence. "The bride," Vale said, her voice steady and clear despite the tremor I could detect if I listened carefully, "is my sister." The words hit the chapel like a physical force. I felt my knees wobble. And if my father hadn't been holding my arm, I might have fallen directly onto the antique hardwood floors. Someone gasped, maybe my mother, maybe one of the guests, maybe me. The sound echoed in the sudden, complete silence that followed Vale's announcement. I stared at her, my mouth open, trying to process what she'd just said. Sister, we weren't sisters. We'd been best friends for 15 years, but we weren't related. I knew my family history. I was an only child. My parents had tried for years to have another baby after me, but it never happened. That's why they'd always said I was their miracle child, their perfect little family of 3. Vale and I had completely different backgrounds. She'd grown up in Florida before transferring to Asheville Prep during high school. Her last name was Rosario's, not Henderson. She had olive skin and dark hair while I had fair skin and light brown hair. We looked nothing alike. We had different birthdays, different blood types. I knew hers was O-negative because she'd donated blood during a school drive and spent the whole day bragging about being a universal donor. But as I stood there in my wedding dress, staring at my best friend who had just claimed to be my sister, I realized that everyone in the chapel was looking back and forth between us with a new kind of attention, like they were seeing something they hadn't noticed before. Marcus was the first person to find his voice. Vale, I think you might be confused, or maybe this is some kind of, I'm not confused, Vale interrupted, her voice stronger now. And this isn't a joke or a surprise or anything like that. Camila Rose Henderson is my biological sister, and I have proof. She reached into the small clutch purse she'd been carrying, the one that matched her dress and was supposed to contain nothing more than lipstick and tissues for touching up my makeup during the reception. Instead, she pulled out a folded piece of paper and held it up for everyone to see. This is a DNA test, she said, her voice carrying to every corner of the silent chapel. I had it done 3 months ago when I started to suspect the truth. The results came back 2 weeks ago. Camila and I share the same biological parents. We are sisters. The chapel erupted. My mother let out a sound that was somewhere between a gasp and a sob. My father's grip on my arm tightened so much that I knew I'd have bruises later. Guests started talking all at once, a buzz of confused voices trying to make sense of what they'd just heard. That's impossible, my mother called out from the back of the chapel, her voice shaky but audible over the murmur of confused guests. That's absolutely impossible. Camila is our only child. We don't know anything about. She couldn't finish the sentence, but she didn't need to. Everyone in the chapel understood what she was trying to say. She was denying that Vale could be their daughter, denying that they'd ever had another child, denying that any of this could possibly be true. But Vale wasn't backing down. Mr. and Mrs. Henderson, she said, turning to address my parents directly while still speaking into the microphone. I know this is shocking, and I know you probably don't remember me, but one was born on March 15, 1994, at Mission Hospital in Asheville. I was given up for adoption when I was 3 days old. The adoption was arranged through Catholic Family Services, and the birth parents were listed as Robert James Henderson and Linda Marie Henderson. The specific details hit like bullets. Those were my parents' full names, including their middle names that most people didn't know. Mission Hospital was where I'd been born to, though 14 months later, Catholic Family Services was an organization my parents had volunteered with when I was younger, helping with their annual charity drives. My father had gone completely white. He was staring at Vale like she was a ghost, his mouth slightly open, his usually composed demeanor completely shattered. My mother was crying now, not happy wedding tears, but the kind of raw, desperate crying that comes from having your whole world turned upside down in public. This is insane, Marcus said, his voice cutting through the chaos. Vale, I don't know what kind of mistake has been made, but you can't just stop a wedding too. I'm not stopping anything, Vale replied, though her voice was starting to shake now too. I'm just telling the truth. Camila deserves to know the truth before she starts her new life. Everyone deserves to know the truth. She looked directly at me for the first time since this nightmare had begun. Her eyes were filled with tears, but there was something else there too. Something that looked like relief, like she'd been carrying this secret for so long that finally sharing it was worth destroying my wedding day. Cam, she said, her voice softer now, speaking to me instead of the congregation. I'm so sorry. I never wanted it to happen like this. I tried to find another way, tried to figure out how to tell you privately, but every time I started to bring it up, I lost my nerve. And then the wedding got closer and closer, and I realized I couldn't let you get married without knowing who I really am. I tried to speak, tried to ask the 1,000 questions that were racing through my mind, but no sound came out. I felt like I was drowning in sulk and confusion and the weight of 127 pairs of eyes watching my life implode in real time. Pastor Williams, bless him, was trying to regain control of the situation. Perhaps we should pause the ceremony, he said gently, his voice trained to handle crisis situations but clearly out of his depth with this particular crisis. Give everyone a chance to process this information and decide how to proceed. But my mother was already pushing through the guests in the back pews. making her way toward the altar with the determination of someone who was ready to fight for her version of reality. "This is ridiculous," she said, her voice getting louder as she approached. "I don't know what kind of sick joke this is, but my daughter is getting married today, and I won't let some delusional girl with a piece of paper ruin the most important day of her life." She reached the front of the chapel and stood face to face with Vale, who was still holding the microphone and the DNA test results. My mother was smaller than Vale, but she had the fury of someone whose carefully constructed world was being threatened. "Give me that paper," she demanded, reaching for the DNA test. "Let me see what kind of fake nonsense you're trying to pass off as proof." Vale handed over the document without resistance, and my mother unfolded it with shaking hands. Her eyes scanned the page quickly, and I watched her face change from anger to confusion to something that looked like recognition and fear. The chapel had gone quiet again, everyone waiting to see what my mother would find in those test results. Even the photographer had stopped taking pictures, sensing that this had moved beyond the realm of wedding documentation into something much more serious and private. My mother read the paper twice, her lips moving silently as she processed the information. Then she looked up at Vale, then at my father, then at me. And I saw something in her expression that I'd never seen before. It wasn't anger or confusion anymore. It was guilt. "Robert," she called to my father, her voice barely above a whisper, "you need to see this." My father released my arm for the first time since we'd started walking down the aisle and moved toward my mother with the slow, careful steps of someone who knew he was about to receive life-changing information. He took the paper from her hands and read it with the same methodical attention he gave to tax returns and insurance policies. When he finished reading, he looked up at Vale with an expression I couldn't interpret. It wasn't surprise exactly, but it wasn't complete shock either. It was something more complicated, something that suggested this revelation wasn't entirely unexpected. "How long have you known?" he asked Vale quietly. And that's when I realized that my father wasn't asking how long she'd known about the DNA test results. He was asking how long she'd known she was adopted, how long she'd been looking for her birth parents, how long she'd suspected that the Hendersons who'd raised Camila might be the same Hendersons who'd given her up for adoption 30 years ago, which meant he wasn't denying it. He was confirming it. My legs gave out completely, and I sank down onto the front pew in my $5,000 wedding dress, the cathedral train pooling around me like a silk puddle. Marcus was beside me immediately, his hand on my shoulder, trying to offer comfort while dealing with his own shock and confusion. "Cam, breathe," he said softly, "just breathe. We'll figure this out." But I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. I couldn't process the fact that my best friend of 15 years, the person I'd chosen as my maid of honor, the woman I'd called my chosen sister, was apparently my actual sister. A sister my parents had given up for adoption and never told me about. A sister who'd been in my life for half of my existence without any of us knowing the truth. Vale had set the microphone back on its stand and was approaching me carefully, like I was a wounded animal who might bolt at any sudden movement. "Camila," she said, kneeling down in front of me in her sage green dress. "I know this is overwhelming. I know this changes everything, but I also know that finding out we're sisters doesn't change how much I love you or how much I've treasured our friendship. You're still the most important person in my life." I looked into her face, really looked at her for the first time with the knowledge that we might share DNA. Her dark eyes were the same shape as my father's. Her nose had the same slight upturn as mine. Her smile, when she wasn't crying, had the same asymmetrical quality that I'd always been self-conscious about in family photos. How had we never noticed? How had 15 years of friendship, countless sleepovers, shared clothes, and people constantly commenting on how close we were never included a single person saying we looked like we could be related? But even as I was processing these physical similarities, I was also grappling with the larger implications of what had just happened. If Vale was my sister, then my parents had lied to me for my entire life. They'd given up a child for adoption and never told me I had a sibling. They'd let me form a deep friendship with my own sister without ever revealing the truth. And Vale had known. Maybe not for long, but she'd known for at least 2 weeks since the DNA results came back. She'd helped me plan my wedding, attended my bachelorette party, given speeches about how excited she was to stand by my side on the most important day of my life, all while knowing that she was my sister and that our entire relationship was built on a lie. "How long?" I asked, my voice coming out as barely a whisper. "How long have you known?" Vale's eyes filled with fresh tears. "I started suspecting about 6 months ago," she admitted. "There were just too many coincidences. The fact that you were born at Mission Hospital 14 months after I was. The fact that your parents volunteered with Catholic Family Services, the same organization that handled my adoption. The way your father's eyes got sad whenever I talked about not knowing my birth family. Little things that individually didn't mean anything, but together started to form a pattern." She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, smearing her carefully applied makeup. "I ordered the DNA test 3 months ago, but I was too scared to actually spit in the tube for weeks. Part of me didn't want to know. I loved our friendship exactly the way it was. And I was terrified that finding out we were related would change everything between us. So you decided to find out at my wedding?" I asked, anger starting to mix with the shock and hurt. "You couldn't have told me privately. You couldn't have talked to me before I walked down the aisle in front of everyone I've ever cared about." "I tried," Vale said, her voice breaking. "I tried so many times over the past 2 weeks. But every time I started to bring it up, I couldn't find the words. How do you tell your best friend that you might be her sister? How do you explain that her parents have been keeping this secret for 30 years? I kept thinking there had to be a better way, a perfect moment when I could explain everything without hurting anyone." She glanced around the chapel, taking in the confused faces of our families and friends, the abandoned wedding ceremony, the chaos she'd created with her revelation. "But then I realized there was never going to be a perfect moment," she continued. "And I couldn't let you start your marriage, your new life, without knowing the truth about who I really am. You deserve to know before you became Mrs. Chen that your maid of honor is actually your sister." I wanted to be angry with her. I wanted to scream at her for ruining my wedding, for keeping this secret, for choosing this moment to blow up both of our lives. But looking at her face, seeing the genuine anguish and love there, I realized that she'd been in an impossible situation. There was no good way to handle a discovery like this. No perfect timing for a revelation that would change everything. That didn't make it hurt less, but it helped me understand why she'd done what she'd done. Marcus was still sitting beside me, his hand on my back, and I could feel him trying to process all of this alongside me. He'd been planning to marry into a simple, stable family, just me and my parents and normal in-law dynamics. Instead, he was discovering that his bride had a secret sister and parents who'd kept a massive secret for 3 decades. "What do you want to do?" he asked me quietly. "Do you want to postpone the ceremony? Do you want to talk to your parents? Do you want everyone to leave so we can figure this out privately?" I looked around the chapel at the 127 guests who'd come to celebrate our wedding and were now witnessing the most dramatic family revelation of their lives. Some of them looked fascinated, like they were watching a particularly compelling episode of a soap opera. Others looked uncomfortable, like they wanted to leave but didn't know if that would be rude. A few were already gathering their purses and quietly making their way toward the exits. My parents were still standing near the altar, both of them looking like they'd aged 10 years in the past 10 minutes. My father was holding the DNA test results, reading them over and over like he was hoping the information would change if he looked at it in H times. My mother was crying silently, her makeup ruined, her carefully planned mother of the bride appearance destroyed by the weight of secrets she'd apparently been carrying for decades. And Vale was still kneeling in front of me in her sage green dress, my biological sister who'd been my best friend for half my life without any of us knowing the truth. This was supposed to be the happiest day of my life. Instead, it had become the day that everything I thought I knew about my family, my history, and my closest relationship turned out to be built on lies and missing information. But as I sat there in my wedding dress, surrounded by the wreckage of my carefully planned ceremony, I realized something else. I was still me. Marcus was still the man I loved, And Vale, whether she was my best friend or my sister or both, was still one of the most important people in my world. The revelation had changed everything and nothing at the same time. The question was, what were we going to do about it? The chapel had mostly emptied by the time we finally convinced my parents to tell us the whole truth. Pastor Williams had graciously suggested that the immediate family retreat to his office while the guests went home, promising that the reception venue would be notified and arrangements would be made for everyone who traveled from out of state. Marcus had taken charge of the logistics with his usual calm efficiency while I sat in my wedding dress trying to process the fact that my entire life story had just been rewritten. My parents sat across from Vale and me in Pastor Williams's small office, looking like defendants waiting for sentencing. The DNA test results were spread out on the desk between us, along with a folder of documents that Vale had brought: adoption papers, birth certificates, hospital records that she'd spent months tracking down through public records, and freedom of information requests. "Start from the beginning," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "I want to know everything." My father cleared his throat and looked at my mother, who nodded reluctantly. "We were so young," he began, his voice barely above a whisper. "I was 22, your mother was 21. We'd been married for less than a year when she got pregnant the first time." The first time. Those 3 words hung in the air like an accusation. I'd always been told I was their miracle baby, their perfect planned child. I'd never known there had been a first time. "We weren't ready," my mother continued, her voice thick with tears. "We were living in a tiny apartment. I was still in college finishing my education degree. Your father was working construction and barely making enough to support the 2 of us. When I found out I was pregnant, we were terrified." She wiped her eyes with a tissue that Pastor Williams had quietly provided. "We thought about keeping the baby. We really did. But we were so unprepared, so broke, so young. My parents had disowned me for marrying your father instead of the boy they'd picked out for me. His parents thought we were making a mistake by getting married so young. We had no support system, no money, no idea how to raise a child." Vale was listening intently, her hands folded in her lap, her earlier confidence replaced by a vulnerable curiosity about the circumstances of her birth. She'd spent 30 years wondering why her biological parents had given her up, and now she was finally getting answers. The pregnancy was difficult. My father continued. "Your mother had terrible morning sickness. She had to drop out of school for a semester, and I was working double shifts trying to save money for the baby. We went to counseling through the church, and the counselor suggested we consider adoption." "Catholic Family Services," Vale said quietly. "It wasn't a question." My mother nodded. "They said they had families who were ready to give a child everything we couldn't provide. Stable homes, financial security, college funds already set up. They made it sound like giving up the baby would be the most loving thing we could do." I tried to imagine my parents at 21 and 22. Scared and broke and facing an unplanned pregnancy. It was hard to reconcile that image with the stable, middle-class couple who'd raised me with clear plans and careful budgets and never a hint that they'd once been young and reckless. "When Vale was born," my father continued, "we held her for 3 days. The social worker said it would help with closure, help us say goodbye properly. She was so beautiful, so perfect. She had these dark eyes that seemed to look right through you, and this way of gripping your finger like she never wanted to let go." Vale started crying then. Quiet tears that she didn't try to hide. "Did you name me Esperanza?" my mother whispered. "We named you Esperanza, which means hope in Spanish. We hoped that whoever adopted you would keep the name, but we knew they probably wouldn't." "They didn't," Vale confirmed. "The adoptive family changed it to Valentina. When the adoption was finalized, I didn't find out about Esperanza until I was 18 and got access to my original birth certificate. The pieces were starting to fit together in ways that made my chest ache." Vale had always been drawn to Spanish culture, had minored in Spanish literature in college, had chosen to live in cities with large Hispanic populations. I thought it was just personal preference. But now I realized it might have been something deeper, a subconscious connection to the name and identity she'd lost as a 3-day-old baby. "What happened after the adoption?" Marcus asked. He'd been quietly supportive throughout this conversation, but I could see the questions in his eyes. He was trying to understand how the people who'd raised me could have made such a profound decision and then never spoken about it. "We tried to move on," my mother said. "We finished school, your father got a better job, we moved to Charlotte and bought our first house. We told ourselves we'd done the right thing, that Esperanza was with a family who could give her everything we couldn't. But it was hard," my father admitted. "Harder than anyone had prepared us for. We grieved for months. Every baby we saw, every child in a grocery store, reminded us of what we'd lost. The counselors had said we'd feel relief, but mostly we just felt empty. That's why you waited so long to have me," I realized. It wasn't because they'd been focused on their careers or waiting for the perfect time. It was because they'd been processing the trauma of giving up their first child. My mother nodded. "We waited 14 months before we even started trying again. We wanted to make sure we were ready, emotionally and financially, to keep the next baby. When I got pregnant with you, we were so paranoid about everything going wrong that I barely left the house for the first trimester. And you never told me any of this because," my parents exchanged a look that contained 30 years of shared guilt and rationalization. "At first, we thought we'd tell you when you were older," my father explained, "but as years went by, it became harder and harder to bring up. How do you tell your child that they have a sister you gave away? How do you explain that you were different people then, that you made different choices? Especially when you turned out to be such a perfect child," my mother added. "You were so responsible, so well-adjusted, so happy with your life as an only child. We convinced ourselves that telling you would only hurt you, that there was no benefit to sharing something that would just make you question everything you thought you knew about your family." I could see the logic in their reasoning, but it still felt like a betrayal. 30 years of family dinners and holidays, and conversations about our family history, and they'd never once mentioned that I had a sister somewhere in the world. "But you stayed in touch with Catholic Family Services," Vale said. "You volunteered with them. I found records of your donations going back 20 years. My father looked surprised. "How did you?" "I hired a private investigator," Vale admitted. "When I started suspecting we might be related, I wanted to be absolutely sure before I said anything. The investigator found your volunteer records, your donation history, even some old newspaper clippings from charity events you'd attended." She pulled out another folder from her bag and spread out photocopies of documents. Pictures of my parents at various Catholic Family Services fundraisers, their names listed on donor recognition walls. Volunteer schedules showing my mother helping with adoption paperwork processing. "You stayed connected to the organization that handled my adoption for decades," Vale continued. "That's not a coincidence. You were looking for information about me, weren't you?" My mother broke down completely then, sobbing in a way I'd never seen before. "We just wanted to know you were okay," she managed between tears. "The adoption was closed, so we couldn't get updates directly, but by volunteering with the agency, we sometimes heard general statistics about how their adoptions were working out. We never got specific information about you, but it made us feel connected to what had happened. And you never thought to look for me directly." "We didn't think we had the right," my father said quietly. "We'd made the choice to give you up. We didn't think it was fair to disrupt your life with new parents just because we were curious about how you'd turned out." I understood their reasoning, but I also understood Vale's perspective. She'd grown up wondering about her biological family, creating stories about who they might be and why they'd given her up. The idea that they'd been nearby for years, that they'd even been in the same city when she moved to Asheville for high school, that they'd never reached out despite staying connected to the adoption agency. It must have felt like a second abandonment. "How did you figure out that Camila and I knew each other?" Marcus asked. Vale smiled through her tears. "Social media. When I started investigating the Hendersons who might be my birth parents, I found your dad's Facebook page. He had pictures from Camilla's college graduation, her birthday parties, family vacations, and in some of those pictures, there was a girl who looked familiar." She pulled out her phone and showed us a screenshot she'd saved. It was from my 25th birthday. party, a group photo that my mother had posted on Facebook. Vale and I were standing next to each other, our arms around each other's waists, both of us laughing at something someone had said just before the picture was taken. That's when I knew for sure. Vale said, "I'd been in dozens of photos with your family over the years, and I'd never realized I was looking at my birth parents and my biological sister." The irony was almost too much to process. Vale had been searching for her biological family while unknowingly becoming best friends with her sister. My parents had been wondering about their first daughter while watching her grow up through pictures I'd shared, never realizing they were seeing the child they'd given up for adoption. "So what happens now?" I asked. It was the question everyone had been avoiding, but it needed to be addressed. "Where do we go from here?" Vale looked at me uncertainly. "I don't know. I never planned beyond telling you the truth. I just knew. I couldn't let you get married without knowing who I really was." "Well, we're still getting married," Marcus said firmly. "Maybe not today, maybe not in the way we originally planned. But this doesn't change how Camila and I feel about each other." I felt a surge of gratitude toward him. Throughout this entire crisis, he'd been steady and supportive without trying to take control or make decisions for me. He'd let me process the revelation at my own pace while making it clear that his commitment to our relationship hadn't wavered. "But everything else changes," I said, looking around the room at my parents and my sister, not just my best friend anymore. "We can't just pretend this didn't happen. We can't go back to the way things were before." My mother looked terrified. "Does this mean you won't forgive us? Does this mean we lose you too?" The pain in her voice made my chest tight. I was angry about the lies, confused about the implications, hurt that they'd kept such a massive secret for so long. But I also understood that they'd been young and scared when they made the decision to give Vale up for adoption, and that they'd been trying to protect me in their own misguided way by not telling me about her. "You don't lose me," I said, "but things have to be different now. No more secrets, no more pretending that our family history is simple and straightforward. If we're going to move forward, it has to be with complete honesty." I turned to Vale, who was watching me with hopeful, uncertain eyes. "And you're not just my maid of honor anymore. You're my sister. That means we have to figure out what that relationship looks like. What it means for our friendship, what it means for our families." "I want that," Vale said immediately. "I've wanted a sister my whole life, and it turns out I've had one for 15 years. I just want to figure out how to do this right." Pastor Williams, who'd been quietly observing our family crisis, spoke up for the first time. "If I may offer some guidance," he said gently, "situations like this are never easy, but they're also opportunities for growth and healing. The truth has a way of coming out eventually, and while the timing wasn't ideal, the fact that it's finally been shared means you can all start building relationships based on honesty instead of secret." He was right. The wedding might have been ruined, but the revelation had also freed us from decades of hidden truth. Vale no longer had to wonder about her biological family. My parents no longer had to carry the weight of their secret, and I no longer had to live without knowing I had a sister. So we postponed the wedding, I decided, give everyone time to process this, figure out our new family dynamic, and then plan a celebration that includes the whole truth about who we are. Marcus squeezed my hand. "How long do you think you'll need?" I looked at Vale, then at my parents, then back at the man I still wanted to marry despite everything that had just happened. 6 months, long enough to get to know my sister as my sister instead of just my best friend. Long enough for my parents to explain 30 years of family history that I'm just now learning about. Long enough to figure out how to blend a family that's been broken apart by secrets. And maybe long enough for Vale to be my sister of honor instead of my maid of honor, I added with a small smile. Vale started crying again, but this time they were tears of relief and joy. "I would love that," she said. "I would absolutely love that." 6 months later, the second wedding was smaller but infinitely more meaningful. We held it in my parents' backyard in Charlotte, with just immediate family and closest friends, the people who'd supported us through the chaos of discovering our family's hidden truth. Vale walked down the makeshift aisle first, wearing the same sage green dress but with a new title, Sister of Honor. She carried a bouquet of white roses and eucalyptus. But this time her smile was genuine and unguarded, free from the weight of secrets she'd been carrying. My parents had spent the 6 months in family therapy, working through their guilt about the adoption and their decision to keep it secret. They'd also reconnected with Catholic family services, this time to get counseling about how to build a relationship with the daughter they'd given up 30 years ago. Vale had moved back to North Carolina, taking a job with a photography studio in Asheville so she could be closer to the family she'd finally found. She'd also started therapy to process the complex emotions of discovering that her best friend was her sister and that her birth parents had been nearby for years. As for me, I'd spent the 6 months learning how to be a sister, not just a friend. It was different, deeper in some ways, more complicated in others. There were moments when I mourned the simplicity of our friendship. But there were more moments when I marveled at the fact that the person I'd chosen as my closest friend had actually been my family along. When Marcus and I exchanged vows, the second time, the words felt more honest. We weren't just promising to love each other. We were promising to build a life together that could withstand unexpected revelations, family secrets, and the kind of chaos that comes from learning that everything you thought you knew about your history was incomplete. I promised to love you through DNA tests and disrupted ceremonies, I said during my vows, making the small crowd laugh. I promised to choose you every day, even when my maid of honor turns out to be my sister and my wedding turns into a family therapy session. Marcus's vows were simpler but just as meaningful. I promise to love not just you, but all the family we're still discovering. I promise to build a marriage strong enough to hold all the truth we're still learning about ourselves. The reception was held in the same backyard, with string lights hung between the trees and a playlist that Vale had curated, a mix of our favorite songs from 15 years of friendship and some new additions that reflected our evolving relationship as sisters. During the reception, Vale gave a speech that she'd been working on for months. 6 months ago, I made a decision that changed everything, she said, holding a microphone much more confidently than she had in the chapel. I decided that love was more important than timing, that truth was more important than perfection, and that family was more important than preserving a beautiful moment. She looked at me, her eyes bright with tears that were purely happy this time. Camila, you've been my sister for 15 years. I just didn't know how to tell you. But now that we all know the truth, I can say with complete honesty that I am so proud to be your sister, so grateful that fate brought us together even before we knew we belonged together, and so excited to watch you build a beautiful life with Marcus. The speech got a standing ovation, but more importantly, it felt like the final piece of our new family puzzle clicking into place. Later that night, after the guests had gone home and the decorations had been taken down, Vale and I sat on my parents' porch swing, still in our formal dresses, talking about everything and nothing the way we'd done for 15 years. Do you regret it? I asked her. The way you told me, I mean. The timing, the drama, all of it. Vale considered the question seriously. I regret that it ruined your perfect wedding day, she said, but I don't regret telling you the truth. And I don't regret the fact that it forced all of us to be honest with each other in a way we'd never been before. She was right. The revelation had been devastating in the moment, but it had also been liberating. We were no longer a family built on carefully maintained secrets. We were a family that had survived the truth and chosen to love each other anyway. Besides, Vale added with a grin, now we have the best how we found out we were sisters story of anyone who's ever lived. Most people just get a phone call or a letter. We got a full dramatic wedding revelation with witnesses and everything. I laughed, realizing that she was right about that too. Our story was chaotic and painful and completely unplanned, but it was also uniquely ours. So what's next for the Henderson sisters? I asked. Well, Mrs. Chen, Vale said, emphasizing my new married name. I was thinking we could start planning your first anniversary party. But this time, I promise not to drop any bombshells during the celebration. What if you discover we're actually triplets? I asked, only half joking. Vale pretended to consider this. Then I'll tell you privately, like a normal person, instead. of grabbing a microphone in front of 127 people. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the stars and processing everything that had changed and everything that had stayed the same. Vale was still my closest friend, my confidant, my chosen family. But now she was also my actual family, my sister, my blood relative who'd found her way back to me through a combination of coincidence, determination, and sheer stubborn love. Thank you, I said finally. For what? For being brave enough to tell the truth, even when it was the worst possible timing. For caring more about our relationship than about preserving a perfect moment. For being exactly the sister I would have chosen, even if I'd known I was choosing. Vale reached over and squeezed my hand. Thank you for not disowning me when I ruined your wedding. Thank you for giving me a reason to have a second wedding that was even better than the first one. Thank you for being the best accidental sister anyone could ask for. And that's how we ended up, not just as best friends who'd become sisters, but as sisters who'd chosen to remain. 6 months later, the second wedding was smaller but infinitely more meaningful. We held it in my parents' backyard in Charlotte. With just immediate family and closest friends, the people who'd supported us through the chaos of discovering our family's hidden truth. Vale walked down the makeshift aisle first, wearing the same sage green dress but with a new title, Sister of Honor. She carried a bouquet of white roses and eucalyptus. But this time her smile was genuine and unguarded, free from the weight of secrets she'd been carrying. My parents had spent the 6 months in family therapy, working through their guilt about the adoption and their decision to keep it secret. They'd also reconnected with Catholic Family Services, this time to get counseling about how to build a relationship with the daughter they'd given up 30 years ago. Vale had moved back to North Carolina, taking a job with a photography studio in Asheville so she could be closer to the family she'd finally found. She'd also started therapy to process the complex emotions of discovering that her best friend was her sister and that her birth parents had been nearby for years. As for me, I'd spent the 6 months learning how to be a sister, not just a friend. It was different, deeper in some ways, more complicated in others. There were moments when I mourned the simplicity of our friendship. But there were more moments when I marveled